Hello everyone, thank you for joining. Welcome to another of the Nature, Towns and Cities Taster webinars. This one is focused on greener communities and particularly working in partnership. I'm Matilda, hello to those I've met already. I'm a project manager for the Nature, Towns and Cities programme. I'm just going to speak for the first few minutes to outline what you can expect from this session and share a little bit more information about the programme. So next slide, please. Thank you. So this session is focused on working in partnership with communities within the urban green sector. And the session will mostly focus on two great examples of working on this agenda. We'll start with an introduction to the topic and then have our two fantastic speakers. Firstly, Julie and Rosie from Octopus Communities, and then Charlie from Your Park, Bristol and Bath. Each case study will share their learnings and experience, and particularly what the benefits of their approach might be, followed by a panel Q&A. You might have seen in the chat already, but we'll also be using an interactive whiteboard to hear from you about your experience working in partnership, whether you're from a local authority or a community organisation. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. So next slide, please. Thank you. So before we dive into the topic today, here's a few helpful bullet points of housekeeping. So as you know, we're going to have a panel Q&A at the end of the session, and it'd be great to have your questions submitted throughout. So to submit a question, you use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen now. If you could use that rather than putting your questions in the chat, then we can make sure they go to the speakers directly. We've also enabled automatic captioning for the day. So if you want to turn these on or off, you can do so in those settings at the bottom of your screen as well. If you need any help with your tech, you can message us via the chat and we can try and help. Then lastly, this session is being recorded and we will email it to you directly in the coming days, and it will also be available via our website. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit more about that interactive whiteboard I mentioned. You can see a link in the chat to use it now. So if everyone could go ahead and open that, that would be fantastic. We'd love to hear from you throughout the session today, and this is one of the ways that we'll do that. So to access the Miro board, you can use the link in the chat. You could also put a message in there if you need any help to access it. So please do add to the board throughout, specifically answering the questions which are on the screen now and in the Miro board, which are all about how you can build trust and overcome the challenges of working in partnership. There'll also be a 5-minute pause between sessions where you can have a break and work on the whiteboard. We'll then pull out some of your answers and some of your thoughts from the board to start our panel discussion. Just for your information, the board also includes some helpful links to things discussed today and at previous webinars, including some more information about the Nature, Towns and Cities programme. Next slide, please. Okay, so for anyone who hasn't been to our previous taster webinars, before we dive into talking about greener communities, I also wanted to say a little bit more about Nature, Towns and Cities and a little bit about how this all fits together. So in October, we hosted an introductory webinar where we talked about the programme for over an hour, and you can watch that back now via our website if you want any more information after this. So Nature, Towns and Cities is a wider programme which aims to work with at least 100 towns and cities across the UK to transform access to green space. The programme has people at the heart of it, and the overall goal is about millions more people enjoying time outdoors in their local urban place. The programme includes a grant scheme, an accreditation process, and an inclusive network. The grant will support many towns and cities with much needed capacity to do this work. The accreditation process will provide the assurance and confidence places are on the journey to achieving their goals in this area. And the network will provide the inspiration, support, connection, and capability for people to take action everywhere. The programme was founded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Natural England and the National Trust. We're working closely with Nature Scot, Natural Resources Wales and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, and we hope lots more partners in the future. Next slide, please. So this webinar and this taster series of webinars gives a flavour of what's to come from the network component of Nature, Towns and Cities specifically. The network is the part of the programme which is designed to build confidence, capability and connection, ultimately to support those working on improving access to green space. It's open to everyone and it's free to be a member. Through the network, you'll gain access to knowledge and successful solutions about what's working when it comes to green spaces. It will be a place to connect with other people who are leading for change from a range of fields relevant to towns and cities, including working with communities, green infrastructure, and green finance. There'll be opportunities to collaborate and connect with each other to build new partnerships. It's a space to tap into the collective wisdom of peers and experts from the sector and beyond. Specifically, you'll be able to take part in and lead events, join cohort learning activities, and access resources. The network will be shaped by all of us, and in collaboration with you, it will grow, iterate, and evolve to best serve those working on urban green spaces. It's an opportunity to be part of something bigger, and ultimately the network will help the Nature Towns and Cities programme create a movement for change. So please do sign up to our mailing list and visit the website now to keep up to date with the programme, to access support, and to read more about how you can be involved. So that's everything from me today. I'm going to hand to our chair, who is Rory Crawford, Project Manager for Nature Neighbourhoods. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, good to see you, hope you're all right. Yes, as Matilda says, I'll be chairing the session today. I manage the Nature Neighbourhoods project based here at the National Trust, working both in partnership with big NGOs, you can see some of the logos down there, and community organisations funded by National Lottery and Co-op. And one of the core ingredients for community-led greening, which is sort of what we're talking about today, is effective partnership working with the community sector. And we thought that would merit a little bit of framing at the start of the session, because while this will have similarities with any partnership that I'm sure many of you have been involved in, if not all of you, there are some unique considerations that are worth bearing in mind. And this presentation is actually one that I've developed for an internal audience. I'm doing some webinars this week with colleagues at National Trust. But with a few adaptations, I think it's hopefully relevant for this audience too. So next slide, please. Now, before I dive into some of the more specific aspects, I think it's a useful starting point for any partnership to understand where your organisation and you and your team fit in. So it probably goes without saying that this is kind of what partnerships are all about, but I think understanding that we've all got unique roles in whatever ecosystem we're operating in is really important. So having a proper and honest appraisal of what your strengths and weaknesses are is really key. You can't really understand others without understanding yourself, and to be properly honest, it's probably important to hear from some external voices when you're considering that as well. So what are we good at, what are we bad at, and what can we get better at in the process of working with those that do that thing well? And I've, of course, as a bird lover, used a bird analogy here, which I hope makes sense to people. Unfortunately, we don't have flamingos at my local park, but we do have mallards. Next slide, please. Sort of linked to understanding our niche and the niche of other organisations is knowing what baggage you bring with you, both good and bad. Both national organisations and local authorities and smaller organisations will hold a particular position in people's minds, which can be amazing or awful or anywhere in between. I know folk working at councils don't need to be told this in particular. And of course, it's not your job to guess what every individual thinks, but I do think it's helpful to understand the critiques in particular. You might even have, personally agree or have direct experience with them. And I think it's okay to express a degree with sympathy, particularly if we're thinking about things like silo work and our bureaucracy or the speed that things can tend to go at, because they're things that we all personally encounter at work. And equally, there might be folk who've got even higher expectations of what you can actually do within your remit. Again, I don't feel like I've got to tell this audience about expectation management, but I think the sort of limitation side of it is helpful to have your head wrapped around. Next slide, please. So a bit about organisational ego and find your purpose. I think everyone is susceptible to thinking that their organisation is the most important. And obviously it's important to know what your organisation wants, and you've probably got a good idea of this from your strategy or however it boils down to your particular level in terms of targets or KPIs or whatever. But of course, it's not anyone else's job to care. And I think the worst space you can be in a partnership is in competition, either quietly or out loud, over whose specific strategy wins the day. So I think, there's much less of this around nowadays, I'd say, but it is helpful to bear that in mind. And it does require some intentional work, I think. And I think that really is about collaborating clearly on the purpose of your work at the outset. This is really important, and particularly around green space and community greening. What are the overlaps in your missions? How can you help each other by doing things you're both best at, and being clear not only on your purpose, but how you'll do things together is really critical, as it's obviously going to have a big impact on your outcomes. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Next slide, please. Now, even if you address your organisational baggage and ego, there's still power dynamics to consider. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with power dynamics. This is the degree of influence or control one person or group can exercise over another person or group. And there's three sort of main manifestations of that. I think in this context, one's around communication, interrupting or dismissing the ideas of others over resources, so access to information or money, and then of course decision-making authority as well. And as a member of staff for whoever you work for, you could find yourself on either side of these power dynamics, depending who else is in the room. So in one context, a big organisation might be dominant, in another you might feel dominated. So a starting point to addressing these is sort of ensuring they're named openly in discussion, and that can help create a bit of awareness and help change behaviour. But it's really important to remain vigilant and do active things to address this. Next slide, please. I'm not going to say too much about this. This is essentially a sort of ladder about engagement and working with people. I don't have loads of time at the start here. I think the main point here is that we often spend more time than we ought to in the doing for space, and sometimes even doing to. And actually, we could be doing a lot more in the doing with space. That's co-production and co-design. And I really encourage folks to dive into that. It's a great way of addressing power dynamics and a great way of getting people on board with implementation. Next slide, please. This is just a bit of a summary of what co-design is. I've robbed this actually from a contractor we work with in our project called Alex Quattrone. The point here is that if you're going to involve people in creating whatever it is you're creating, it can have a big influence over the partners that you might want to bring on board. Are there community organisations that are much closer to those with lived experience, who are convening particular groups who might be able to bring a whole host of new ideas with them? Next slide, please. And on my title slide, you would have seen I used the word unusual suspects as opposed to the usual suspects. I don't mean as in unusual, as in weird. I think if we're serious about making sure we open up green space to everyone, we need to work with a different set of organisations than those that brought us to the current point, which is that we've got very unequal access to nature. So I'd really encourage reaching out to local voluntary sector partnerships and into other places to think about how we sort of bring in that fabric of the community, those different aspects of community into conversations to make sure our interventions are sustainable and successful. There's a few suggestions in the slide there, and they'll be circulated after this session. Next slide, please. And this is my penultimate one. I alluded to this earlier. I just think, how can we do away with some of the trappings of cumbersome partnerships? And this is particularly important when partnering with community-based organisations that are often heavily under capacity and living project to project. I've put a few prompts up here in terms of things to think about if we're partnering with community organisations, mainly around trust and removing reporting and meeting requirements, and thinking about how we recognise this as an underfed bit of the ecosystem that can deliver a huge amount with very little. And by supporting it, we can achieve much more. So in short, if we can recognise the core purpose and work of a community organisation helps move forward the overlapping parts of our missions, they have a proven delivery record, how can we seek to strengthen and support them through a partnership with minimal burden rather than take it over, do it ourselves, or badge it as ours? Final slide, please. So that's quite enough from me in terms of setting the context. Let's get on to the main event. Joining us, we've got Charlee Bennett, who's the CEO of the brilliant York Park, Bristol and Bath. But first, some of my Nature Neighbourhoods compadres, Julie Parrish and Rosie Apperley. They're the development manager and project coordinator of Octopus Community Network based in Islington. We've got two different models of community-led greening here, but they both demonstrate the importance of partnership with the third sector to deliver true community-led interventions. So I'm going to say take it away to Julie and Rosie.
Hi everyone, thanks Rory. As Rory said, I'm Rosie. I'm just going to give a bit of an overview about Octopus and the context we work in, and then I'll hand over to Julie. So Octopus Community Network, we're a network of 14 of Islington's largest multi-purpose independently run community centres. And within that work, we've been running an urban growing programme for the last 14 or so years. And as Rory mentioned, we are one of the 18 community partners, part of the Nature Neighbourhoods project. Next slide, please. So just to give some context about Islington, it's the third smallest London borough. It's incredibly densely populated, the most densely populated local authority in England and Wales. Significant amounts of land that we do have is on local authority housing estates, which kind of connects with the work that we do. And the borough's also got incredibly high levels of income inequality, really high levels of deprivation, as well as high levels of income. Next slide, please. So just to talk a bit about our journey in terms of urban growing, the work started back in 2010 when lots of reports were coming out about how poor levels of environmental literacy were, particularly amongst children and young people in urban environments. So we got to work on that, and the programme kind of started with taking people out to areas of nature that are nearby, but not in Islington. So places like Epping Forest, we were taking groups out so that they could experience nature, but also places that they could get back to easily. And then in more recent years, we've kind of brought it all closer to home, I guess, and we've started working a lot more directly in the borough, creating new green spaces, and particularly on that housing estate land that I mentioned previously. So working with communities to create community growing spaces, getting people together through growing on council land. And it's been interesting, the kind of full circle of this, because actually what's come up, particularly during our Nature Neighbourhoods conversations, is that people really want nature to be on their doorstep and not a destination. So it really is about increasing nature as soon as people walk out of their door, not just as a destination that they can travel to. I mentioned the data about the environmental literacy, and that's something we do a lot. We work in a really data-driven way, but also within the context of our local authority. So at the moment, Islington's got its Fairer Together 2030 plan, it's got its biodiversity plan and its net zero plans. So we make sure that our work really fits in with what the local authority is doing, and push them on ways that could be implemented as well. And that's led to the council seeing us as a really key collaborator, you know, seeing that there's ways of working that we have and things that we can do that will create a really effective partnership between us, maybe some things that the council aren't able to do themselves. I'll hand over to Julie, and next slide.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I wanted to show this photograph because I think from a local authority point of view, if I was a councillor or council officer, I would be horrified by this site where public land had been put over to community use with designated household beds so that they could grow and mainly grow vegetables. But the context of this photograph, even though it looks quite horrific and sad, is that, as Rosie explained, we operate in one of London's densest, most populated urban environments. And space is a premium. And the reason this space here is derelict and abandoned is the fact that the block of flats that are sitting to the right of the wooden fence was something that was built about a year ago and cast a huge, great big shadow over the resident growing space, which meant that they couldn't grow there anymore. So the good news is that we've just completed a 12-month cycle of community engagement and consultation. I would like to say that the council consulted, we engaged. And what has been the result of that is that this space has been preserved. It's going through a major transformation at the moment, firstly with the site clearance, and then through the engagement activities that we run with the residents, this space will be transformed into a woodland growing area. And then what we will do as well with the community is help them form a collective management group so they can actually take on and run the space as a resident group. Next slide, please. In terms of going back to what Rory said about the importance of partnership working, we are, I must stress, a tiny charity. You're looking at the staff team of me and Rosie, and we've got like 2 full-time equivalents of people who work on our urban growing programme. So we're tiny, but we're ambitious. And the reason we can be tiny and ambitious is that we work in partnership. I've got over 40 years of experience working in partnership design, development, management across Europe. And I must say that partnership working is really, really difficult if you have those egos in the room. So thanks for drawing upon that, Rory. But the reason we've got here today, where we're a trusted partner of Islington Council, is that we have proven that we can do things that the council can't, and that is primarily around community engagement, but also actually making things happen. And the proof of that trust-based relationship is that we were asked to develop a community-led growing action plan on behalf of the council, which was a real privilege to be asked to do. And then that resulted in Islington creating their Islington Greener Together strategy and action plan. And some of the photographs you're seeing there is the launch of that action plan and strategy on one of the sites that we were able to develop on one of the estates. So my main message in this slide is that you have to work in a relational way and work with organisations who are grassroots and on the ground. I would ask local councils to be brave and be prepared to relinquish some of their power. For residents and people to be brave as well and just take on more responsibility in their neighbourhood. It is public land, and you have the right to use it and access it. And then for the VCS as well to be challenging and creative and solution driven and act as a bridge between the council and residents. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of some of the estate-based gardening groups that we work with. But on this slide, I want to focus on our community plant nursery. It is actually next door to the woodland garden that you've just seen. It's a space that we have a 5-year license for. We are about to sign up another 5-year license. And what we do at the community plant nursery is we grow on and supply plants to about 26 growing groups in the borough. And also as well, we produce food for local community food hubs. And we also have this site as a demonstrator site. So those who are developing and creating new green spaces and gardens can come along and learn and engage in workshops. So the key message from this slide is that to make partnerships work, you really need a diverse set of people together. You have to build the resident power, the agency and autonomy. People have been told for a long time that they can't sit on the grass, they can't walk on the grass, you can't play on the estate. I think that's history now. We're now in the time when we want to see things develop. Developing the real true relationship with council officers and councillors, and you'll see this through a video that we've got to show here as well. We're all part of the solution, so we need to work together. And by pulling together the councillors, the council officers, residents and our team, I don't think we'll have achieved what we set out to achieve. And I would always say that you always have to have rooted in the local neighbourhood an anchor who will enable that sustainability for the community. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this picture because It's leading up to the video that we'll show you, but this is an estate that we found 3 abandoned spaces on, a lot of it being used for antisocial behaviour. And we wanted this space for the community and worked with the community really, really hard to secure these 3 spaces over the course of about 2 years. It's a place where people have come together to grow food, to eat food, to dig the land, and it's just been really amazing to see how places can be transformed. And not only that, it's actually been a space where we've been able to develop a blueprint for how you can actually develop that management collective, which is a combination of councillors, council officers, local residents, and a local community centre. So they become the management group for the space. Next slide, please. I can't go into the next video or the rest of the presentation without saying the importance of food, the social benefits of growing food, and how that brings diverse communities together. A lot of our focus is moved around the food growing because it's just the sign of the times, I think, but anything that brings food and community together, I think, is really, really important. Next slide, please. This is the time for the video. There will be a slight pause, so just bear with the tech team whilst we get the video up and running. As I said, this video is made at the Highbury Quadrant estate where we've developed the 3 growing spaces.
The wildlife and meadow area on Highbury Quadrant estate are basically 3 unkept and unloved areas on the estate which have basically got no proper managerial structures in place in regards to their use. We have managed to actually secure some funding and managed to actually now develop an activities and programme and project for bringing these spaces into use. We're looking to very much make the actual area a sort of flagship in regards to what can be done with areas of this nature in regards to various locations that we have like this across the borough.
It sounds a bit of a political cliche almost, you know, the best thing about Islington is Islington people, but it's really true. And especially the young people are what makes our borough. And so if we're doing anything, we have to do it with our communities. And we also have a duty to make sure that our communities have the best possible things that we can. So if we can take a bit of wild space like this and enjoy it and work with it and build our communities in it, as well as building the space as a lovely place to be, then that's what I'd like to see across the whole of the borough, which is really what community life is about and what makes living in Islington so great.
Over the last few months, we've seen just how important it is to have access to green space as we've all been isolating and staying physically apart. And the other big shock that we know is coming, and we're already seeing the impacts of it, is climate change. And we need to be doing everything we possibly can to tackle the climate crisis. But if we can enable our communities to be resilient, to have good access to green space and access to growing food, that is one thing that the council can be doing that is really making a proper difference.
Thank you. If we can go to the next slide, please. The next couple of slides, drawing my presentation along with Rosie to a close, is that throughout the partnership that we've developed with Islington Council, we've each taken a calculated risk approach. We've brought into the borough in excess of, I would say, about 1.2 million. But the council also bring their funding to the table as well. They bring that money through Thriving Neighbourhoods, which is a new initiative which actually gives residents an opportunity to make an application for how they would like to change their the estate space, and some of the images that you can see there, these are not our projects, but something that has come about through Thriving Neighbourhoods. In terms of the photograph I showed you at the beginning, where the big building went up, the block of flats went up alongside the resident growing space, where we do benefit from the money that brings to the borough as well through the community infrastructure levy and the Section 106. So we are working in partnership to see how that we can bring money in from different places. Next slide, please. Going back a little to what Rory was saying as well, we strongly believe in co-design, and that is from a cross-sector perspective as well. We couldn't achieve anything, either of us, the council or ourselves, without working in collaboration. We have to develop those relationships on an equitable basis. Without that, there will be that power struggle ongoingly, and we must be willing to share those lessons learned that generate solutions, because we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. This is not my saying, but somebody said this to me once, and so I've kept it. And professionals should be on tap and not on top. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie and Rosie. That was absolutely brilliant. Great to sort of hear that key element around being seen as an effective collaborator by the council, right? Like being taken seriously as a sort of prospective partner, and the benefits that can bring as well, like what you said there about bringing other funding and other support from outside is really critical, and also about taking calculated risks, which is part of that thing about making the partnership happen. And I guess you might not necessarily think of a network of community centres as the natural place to go when it comes to green space, but I think Octopus have really demonstrated an approach which connects to the communities in a very meaningful way and delivers the things that people are looking for. So thanks so much for that, and I'm sure that's going to generate lots of interest and questions. And folks, yeah, please do remember the Q&A is there. Stick a question in there if you've got one, and we'll come to it at the panel later if there's anything bubbling away. Okay, slight gear shift, but not a major one, because we're going to hear from Charlie Bennett, who's the CEO of Your Park, Bristol and Bath. Slightly different model. This is not based around community centres, but a parks foundation. Some of you might be familiar with this model, others less so. But a slightly different approach, but one that is still about bringing people in, having a very human face, an inclusive face to thinking about how we imagine green spaces in our cities and towns. So, Charlie, really looking forward to your presentation. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Lovely, thanks Rory. Hi everyone. So yeah, as Rory says, I'm going to be talking to you about how we're supporting communities to be involved in their parks and green spaces in Bristol and Bath. And to start off with, exactly as Rory said, we're a community-led and social impact-driven organisation. But we were established back in 2018 through the Rethinking Parks programme. For those of you who don't know, it was a joint initiative between the National Lottery Community Fund, the Heritage Fund and Nesta to rethink the use and financial sustainability of the UK's public parks. And our idea actually was generated by the community in the first place. So the Bristol Parks Forum, which is an umbrella organisation for park groups locally, came together and identified that there was a charity-shaped hole in the sector locally. And basically the parks groups and volunteers didn't want the additional responsibility of running an organisation. And there were definitely things that they felt a charity could possibly do better than the council, and definitely money that a charity could access that the council can't. So having approached the council, sorry, could you go to the next slide, please? Having approached the council at Bristol, it became very clear that Bristol and Bath were both going to be going for a bid, so it would be far better to do it together. And we were successful in securing just under 200 grand to set up our organisation. So yes, many of you are probably well aware of everything that went on in Rethinking Parks, but if you move on to the next slide, I can tell you more about our specific model. So as I mentioned, we are an added value charity. So we don't take on any of the maintenance, management or ownership of parks and green spaces. All of that stays with the council. And we essentially have a memorandum of understanding between the three parties. That is how we work together. So we have a steering group where we work on a no surprises basis. And crucially, we're completely independent in terms of our trustee and staff decision making. So we don't have any council officers or councillors on our board of trustees. I mean, that never would have been possible when working across two local authority areas with differing politics anyway. But I think it gives us a real strength, particularly when you look at research that's come out around the propensity to give to parks and green spaces. Having an independent charity that is clearly not part of the council is kind of really key to making sure that the opportunity for giving is there. On top of this, we have, as part of our governance structure, now established a lived experience representative group as well, and that is to make sure that people who currently struggle to use parks, who are not necessarily represented within the councils or within our team, have the opportunity to shape our strategic vision and our programme delivery. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So just to recap on what we're all about, because I think in the early days, the councils probably thought we might follow more of the early trajectory of the Parks Foundation in Bournemouth, which was the model that we were replicating through Rethinking Parks, where there was quite a lot of fundraising for infrastructure projects in parks. But what we quickly worked out while we were carving out that niche that Rory described earlier, particularly because we've got a very crowded green sector locally, it became really apparent and clear that what we could really add value to is looking at addressing health inequalities through parks and really using parks as the vehicle for social change. In addition, our priorities are for community parks, so we don't really focus on destination sites because the council have that wrapped up, and we're really focusing on those green spaces that are on people's doorsteps where people should be connecting with nature in their day-to-day lives. We have three main health areas. I'm going to try and demonstrate how we bring all of these together in partnership with the council, both at that strategic level and an operational level, through our work. Next slide, please. I just want to double down on who we're talking about before we move on when I talk about our communities. So as a charity, because we're about addressing health inequalities, we're not necessarily thinking about the people who are already using parks and green spaces. So we're very much focused on underserved groups, and that is people living in higher areas of deprivation in the city, in both cities, and then also the communities who maybe have protected characteristics or are more likely to experience increased barriers to green spaces, and that is disabled people, carers, global ethnic majorities, and I've also forgotten women and girls that should be on there as well. And by using a place-based approach to focus on the areas of highest deprivation, but also really try to understand the experiences of those communities least likely to use parks, we're able to make sure that we're addressing intersectional issues that people might face. And again, I'll talk more about exactly how we do that in a second. And this isn't to say that we don't work with friends groups and park volunteers. In our very early days, we ran a grant programme to support friends groups, and we do still do things like that through our place-based approach. But we more focus with friends groups at a city-wide scale on supporting them to improve their resilience, on how to support a more inclusive range of activities in their parks, on feeling more confident working with a diverse range of people. Because as a charity, we're only a team of 18, and there are 580 parks and green spaces of various different shapes and sizes across our patch. So working really closely with friends groups to support them to do more of what we'd love to see, as well as being more resilient with all of their own activities, is a great way for us to improve our reach and our outcomes. So yeah, we run conferences, we do training, we support them using a community development approach in the areas of highest deprivation, and crucially, we also help them navigate council systems and processes, as well as work with the councils to make some of those easier where we can too. Next slide, please. To inform our work, we use this model, which has been adapted from Bragg and Leck, and essentially sets out the role that parks should play in improving health outcomes for communities day in, day out. So on the outer scale, you've got parks in everyday life, so walking through on your way home from work, popping to the park on your lunch break. In the centre, you've got kind of more nature-based activities. It might be friends groups, work parties, it could be walking groups. anything in between. And then green care is really at that centre. So that's your more green social prescribing programmes. So initiatives that are developed to address specific health outcomes and that health partners should be referring into. And there are a whole host of enabling factors that should be in place to enable communities within a particular neighbourhood or place to be able to access these opportunities. And we very much use a neighbourhood approach to this because we're under no illusion that every park is going to be accessible, inclusive to everybody. And we need to look at the kind of cohort of parks within an area in the hope that you'll be able to find something that works for everybody, regardless of where they are in terms of their health needs and their own personal experiences. So when we go into an area, we look at our parks in terms of that everyday life aspect. Are they accessible? Do they feel safe and welcoming? Are they nature rich? Are people going to see people like them using those spaces? And then as you move up, we need to continually make sure that there are activities people actually want to do, regardless of their background. That they're run by people that look like them, and that there are family-friendly options, things available at the weekend, not just during working hours. And then with green care, of course, we need to make sure that the local health system's aware of all of these opportunities so that referrals happen, and that all of this is shaped by the communities in which the parks sit within. Of course, around all of this is the overall benefits of parks in terms of planetary health. So all of these things, when coming together, will help with the cooling of our cities, reduction of flooding, cleaner air. But yes, we use this model very much to shape how we do things in the areas of highest deprivation. Which brings me on to our work in Hartcliffe and Withywood in South Bristol. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Hartcliffe and Withywood's, if you're aware of Bristol, it's a challenging area. So the estates were essentially built in the 1970s when they were trying to move high intensity of low income areas out of the city centre out onto the outskirts of the city. So very much on the outskirts. Definitely have a lot of struggles in terms of being in the highest 10% of deprivation, definitely a hotspot for green space deprivation, high proportion of disabled residents, but interestingly has loads of potential from a green recovery perspective, with direct connections to the countryside, lovely green finger parks that go through into the centre. But overall, there's a real, because of the way these communities feel left behind by the development of the city, there is this deep-seated feeling of mistrust of the council and of others. We actually started trying to work in this area in our second year of operation, and we were categorically told by the community development team there, do not come and work here until you've got at least 2 years of funding, because this community is really used to organisations popping up, doing a little bit and then vanishing. But I'm pleased to say we managed to get that longer term funding, if you move on to the next slide, to bring our Wild and Well model to South Bristol and Hartcliffe and Withywood specifically. And this is a really great example of our kind of direct project delivery partnership working with the council. So we have a community development worker, essentially, who, when we start in a new area, goes in, builds really strong kind of networks, relationships, and brings community members as well as organisations and crucially the health sector together to think about their local spaces, identify opportunities and kind of provide that support and guidance to get things done whilst working with our local parks operations team as well to make sure that those things are realistic, that there's buy-in there, and when communities come up with ideas, we've got the support in place to make them happen. So yeah, through this Wild and Well approach, we started working in Hartcliffe and Withywood. And it took a good 2 years, really, to properly build up trust and to start making progress with this. And that's very much demonstrated, through, if you move on to the next slide, our Routes to Wellbeing programme, which is a green social prescribing initiative that we run in a Hartcliffe park. For the first 3 months, there was a lot of our kind of provider basically standing in a park on their own. And it took a good kind of full year to get to the point where we are now, where we have consistent referrals in and we're actually at capacity for this green social prescribing project. And that's just a real demonstration of how important it is to kind of build that trust and relationships and be committed to the long haul if you're going to be doing a community engagement in areas that are really challenging. If you move on to the next slide. And so, yeah, we have a place-based approach, but then, as I mentioned earlier, we try to really understand the intersectional issues facing communities. So to do this, we've done some research with disabled people and carers to properly evidence and bring together in one place, backed by a researcher, how local people experience trying to use Bristol and Bath parks when they're living with any kind of disability, healthcare condition, or are a carer. So this has produced a wonderful report, and I'm not saying that there's anything particularly revolutionary in there. I think as kind of park managers, most people would know most of these issues, but having all of that information in one place provided a really useful tool to be able to demonstrate the challenges, to influence, and then also to secure funding. We'll move on to the next slide. And this has led to us being able to take really proactive action. One of the key outcomes that disabled people and carers told us they needed was for parks to be assessed for their accessibility and have actions plans created, but crucially by local disabled people and carers. So over the last year or so, with support from Natural England, we've been co-developing a process through which a group of disabled people and carers with any lived experience can come together to look at a space and make a plan for how to improve it. And that's really exciting. And we've done the first test of that at Hartcliffe Millennium Green in Hartcliffe again. And we've actually got contractors out there at the moment making the first round of improvements to make the community garden area completely accessible, which is really fab. We've also done a lot of influencing with this. So as a result of this research, Bristol's new Parks and Green Spaces strategy is dripping in access, which we're really pleased about. And the council's announced more funding to improve things. So it's just an example of where deeply understanding issues certain communities face and then building that awareness, doing that influencing work can make a real difference. And these community-led park access assessments is a toolkit we're going to be packaging up and making available nationwide for any group. And what's different about it is it's that proper community-led approach whereby the plan should be held by local people, engagement throughout will be done with local councillors, all the key stakeholders, so that instead of waiting for those multi-million-pound grants to redesign parks, we can start to make incremental improvements to spaces that are properly supported by the community in the long term. So we actually start doing some stuff. Next slide, please. And the other element that we have in South Bristol, we've got a lot going on in South Bristol, but with the Wild and Well approach, our community development approach, obviously we have loads of ideas that come up. And our Nature and Community programme is another lovely example of whereby working with the council, who has access to money from UK government and other sources, we've been invited in to shape a project that means that we've got a ranger type role employed by us, but seconded into the council so that we get the benefits of being in both camps. And this person can essentially, as soon as an idea comes forward, can practically go and work and support that community to make it happen, particularly in areas like Hartcliffe and Withywood, where there isn't necessarily the community capacity to have big friends groups who have loads of capacity to get that out there with working parties every week. So yes, moving on to the final slide. No, it's not the final one, nearly. So some of our learnings in terms of what works and some of the challenges in working in partnership, both with the council when we're looking at all parks across Bristol and Bath, and then at that deep community level, is that working at that neighbourhood level is really important, we think. So moving away from focusing on individual parks to looking at that neighbourhood level. And when I say neighbourhood, it would be what a community would identify as their neighbourhood. So something that makes sense to individuals living there. It gives you the ability to look at several parks and explore solutions across all of them, rather than having to have parks answering and that just means that you're able to look at your biodiversity outcomes that you want, as well as your health and your community ones. Timescales is always a biggie. So having more time and councils understanding the time that it takes to do community engagement in the right way is something that we are constantly talking about and trying to kind of get more understanding for. And on top of that, knowing who is best to do what and when. So one of the reasons we were set up is because there was a definite feeling that there are certain things that we could do better. And this kind of builds on one of the challenges that I'll talk about, but having those really honest conversations with council colleagues, whether it's in parks or community engagement, about when a separate organisation is the right one to do it. So Hartcliffe and Withywood is a great example of where there really isn't very much trust of the council within that community. And actually, if the project that we've come in and run there was done by the council, it wouldn't have made half as much progress as if it was with us, where we come in fresh face as a charitable organisation, and we can act as a critical friend in partnership with the community of the local authority as well. So whether it's helping them navigate getting things done with the council, just being a shoulder to cry on sometimes when things don't work, and really being able to hold that community and the individuals in it in a way that makes most sense for them is really, really valuable. Something we've been really lucky in terms of having is a really supportive development team, particularly at Bristol. So whenever there are opportunities that come up for government funding or things that are usually internal to them, we're always kind of there as a key delivery partner that's considered first, and that gives us the ability to develop the right solutions and be in the room at the right time. Flip side of that, of course, is the challenges of really short-term funding applications and councils having the time to develop the bids that make most sense for communities when you're really up against it in terms of time pressure. Shared ambitions and open communication. So we definitely have that. I think our strategy is really clear, and it's very much aligned with both of the local authority strategies, whether it's green infrastructure, public health strategies, or the parks and green spaces strategy. So having that shared vision and that shared kind of journey and pathway for parks is really, really valuable. And we are definitely the kind of key delivery arm that enables the councils to get a lot of the stuff in their strategies done that just isn't possible given the current funding constraints. And because of the way that we work, we enable that deep partnership working and that trust with local communities. We, through our disabled people's work, we've now got a huge partnership of disabled people's organisations and carers organisations locally. We're now doing more social inclusion research to understand the experiences of different ethnic groups across Bristol and Bath, and that gives us a whole new set of partners that we can work with and draw upon and feed, and I suppose combine and feed all of that insight into the council so that their decision making is better and can help address inequalities at scale. Next slide, please. Some of our challenges, and of course there are loads in the day-to-day running of any organisation and project when you're working in public spaces, but yes, having a slight disconnect between some of the strategic goals and ambitions across parks and the reality of the constraints at the operational level can be really difficult. So we've got big ambitions to transform the accessibility of parks and green spaces in Bristol and Bath, but the practicalities of what that means, and well, the council supports that, but the practicality of what that means in terms of new assets and maintenance management and budgets is a real tension for that area of work, because there just isn't the cash to really take some of that forward. So that's a careful relationship that we're always navigating. And the key thing that we always do is build those relationships with the operations team in whatever area that we're working in. Yeah, in some cases we are competitors, kind of back again to Rory's first points, and really kind of doubling down on defining your niche and your role and working out who's best to do what. So we're quite clear that we do a lot of nature stuff, but we're not a nature organisation. So for example, Bristol has and Baines also get a lot of money for nature-based work, and we don't get so involved in that. We use nature as a driver for health outcomes, and obviously all the community stuff that we want to do is grounded in nature, but when there's real specific nature programmes, we leave that to the councils and the wildlife trusts of our area. For us specifically, working across two local authority areas is challenging because really different cultures, identities of those two cities and different politics just means that priorities are different, and you really do need two approaches for each area. And something that we always get asked about, particularly for our model, when we're approached by councils thinking about setting up parks foundations, is around our financial sustainability and what councils need to put in order to have a charity that stands on its own 2 feet. I don't have time to go into that now, but I do have some slides in my presentation that kind of show our financial journey. So yeah, if anyone has any questions about that, I can cover that in the panel, or you will be able to see the figures in there to get an idea of what it's taken to get to where we are now, because we do stand on our own 2 feet now. That's everything from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie. That was absolutely brilliant. And my God, you packed it all in there. Amazing work. A few quotes that I noted down there were about the strategy being dripping in access, and I think that's got to be an aspiration everywhere. It's just brilliant to hear that. and also just about starting to do some stuff, getting some of that incremental work done that's not the multi-million-pound projects. People actually seeing things on the ground is really critical as well. And that point about honest conversations. And maybe if I can sort of paraphrase that quote that always gets misattributed to Einstein, but I don't know who it belongs to, and relate it back to what I showed at the start, is that everybody's a genius, but if you judge a flamingo by its ability to filter food like a mallard, it'll believe its whole life it's daft its whole life. Something along those lines. That was a butchered metaphor and a half, wasn't it? Now, we do have the Miro board open, so the link for that is going to go into the chat. And we're going to have a bit of a break now until 3 o'clock. Use that time, pop to loo, get a cuppa, whatever you need, and please do go and interact with the Miro board. There are some an opportunity to input on challenges and an opportunity to think about partnering with communities. So do dive in there and give us your feedback, and we'll be back for the panel at 3. See you shortly, folks. Hello, folks. Somehow that's already 3 o'clock. Just wait for folk to get back in the room. I can see there's a bit of activity on the Miro board just now. And then I will introduce our panel. Here we all are. Got a full house now. Right, I'm going to give folk till 1 minute past and then we'll get going. Thanks to all the speakers for being so punctual. I was told that I had to, if anyone went over, I had to be the bad cop. I don't like being the bad cop, so no bad cop necessary. Also, a special shout out to Julie. As mentioned in the chat, Julie is currently speaking from a community centre, and it was an excellent talk. Not that we don't think people weren't applauding you during the talk, Julie, but Julie informed us in a WhatsApp group we're using to communicate that there's archery going on in the community centre. So I think Julie's exemplary calm. If you had any apprehensions about working with community organisations, that's a perfect metaphor for someone who is able to calmly continue and present like a consummate professional while literal arrows are being fired around around her. So big shout out to Julie for maintaining that calm.
Well, thankfully they weren't being fired at me. They were just they were just flying past.
Oh, excellent. Now, we've got a couple of questions in the chat already, in the Q&A rather. Folks, I'll encourage you still to get those in via the Q&A function. We've also been joined by someone else here, so you've all met Rosie and Julie from Octopus and Charlie from Your Parks. We've also got Dawn from Natural England. Dawn, are you up for introducing yourself so we can hear your voice?
I can do. Thanks, Rory. Yeah, I'm Dawn Jackson. I work for Natural England. I work on the Nature Towns and Cities Partnership, and I'm also leading for communities in our Connecting People with Nature programme. Thanks very much, Rory.
Thanks, Dawn. Okay, so I'm going to dive in with this one from Paul in the Q&A chat, which is about Parks Foundations, first of all. And the question here is, don't your parks find that local people are excluded from nature-based management discussions where they may have more knowledge than the council, and that a remote council really is not as in tune with nature as local people might or can be?
Yes, basically. It is, yeah, that's something we definitely see play out in South Bristol. So we've taken on doing kind of community and volunteer support at one of the sites that was previously managed by the Avon Wildlife Trust, with their kind of developed management plans, and has now been handed back to the council. And there is always that tension, basically, particularly with the drive to managing sites more for nature, which is part of Bristol's strategy, as well as kind of the nationwide movement. And getting that balance right and supporting communities to have that engagement with the biodiversity officers at the council is something that we try our best to support with. And I'm not saying in any way, shape or form that we've got all the answers to that, and those tensions don't continue to exist, whether it's about opening access through pathways to areas that communities feel should be left wilder, or what type of management happens in terms of completely leaving sites to just do their own thing. So yeah, we try as best we can to support with that, but yeah, there are the challenges of councils kind of managing at a citywide basis and doing that engagement and adapting plans to involve communities who know those sites intricately.
Thanks, Charlie. And I might want to bring in Rosie and Julie here as well. Just interested in the experience from Islington. You know, a London borough is obviously smaller in size and scale. Do you notice any difference? You know, is there a closer connection in terms of understanding of that site and community feeling, or you know, what's your perception of that issue?
I think in terms of accessibility to parks, there's been really quite important for Islington as a borough, because it was quite noticeable some years ago that parks were frequented by a lot of people who were not necessarily doing the right thing in parks. I'm trying to be diplomatic there. And so the council engaged with ourselves and other local organisations working in this space to look at how we redesign and redevelop parks within the borough. And in fact, we worked with Islington Council on the reimagining of 4 parks within Islington. And again, just looking at the relationship of where the council has the land, they've got the resources, the money, the expertise, but we have access to residents. And just like Charlie said in her presentation, we're often sent into communities where there's not a great deal of trust with the council. So I think, again, if you form that relationship to improve access, that access will come. One of the results of doing that work was that we've been running environmental summer schools in the park. So once again, we were given the space to be able to deliver activities in parks. So we were just told, don't burn anything down and, you know, clear up after you leave. But that trust relationship is there. And then Islington got heavily involved in the Future Parks Accelerator programme, which has done wonders for the parks. Now, for parks, you see everything from like yoga through to, you know, forest schools happening in the park. So it's been transformed, but it's not overnight. It is about making a concerted effort to make sure that all people from very diverse communities access the parks.
Thanks, Julie. And Dawn, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to chip in from a sort of central perspective. I'm thinking of things like local nature recovery strategies and stuff like that. Is there a sort of national frame that can help, certainly in the context of England, with having some of those conversations and connecting a council more effectively with, you know, local community stakeholders?
Yeah, and I mean, I can't say that we nationally, and this is, I'm talking in England, obviously, with Natural England. I can't say that nationally in Natural England we have that answer that I could give very neatly to you. But yes, local nature recovery strategies is one vehicle by which that conversation can happen. I know Charlie, I think in her presentation, mentioned green social prescribing, which again is another brilliant way in. From our, you know, from the insights from the work we've been doing, the research that we've been doing, I really agree with what Julie's been saying about offering a wide variety of activities that offer lots of different ways in for communities. In the community hub work that we've been researching, that seems to be a real asset that local authorities and community groups can really bring to local people and engage as diverse an audience as possible. I don't think there's a silver bullet there. I think there's a lot of trial and error. But, you know, we're sort of working a way towards understanding that more nationally of what works where and why.
Charlie, I see you come off mute. Do you want to add something to that?
I'd say something that we've done really at a very practical level that's been really successful is in South Bristol, we kind of facilitate and host a meeting between the local community and the local parks operation team on a quarterly basis, just to open up that narrative and hold it in a much more constructive way than it had been before. And that enables the community to really feel heard by the operations team and the operations team to act on the community's views. And the other model that we've also seen really successful for this in Bristol are community climate action plans. So previously very focused on the climate side of things, but actually a huge amount of what comes out of those tends to be nature focused, and it provides a really constructive, useful tool for communities at a place base to be able to influence the management of their local sites for nature.
Great, that's really practical advice, Charlie. Thanks for adding that, and thank you, Dawn, for your addition as well. And that's maybe a helpful bridge to the next question. So there's a question here about how best for local authorities to reach and partner with local groups when it's a top-down process, for example, when redesigning a park and there is no charity organisation set up to help. I think my own local authority here actually would probably reflect this. I've got my own personal thoughts about this, but I would like to open it up to the panel. First of all, would anyone like to jump in with any burning thoughts on this first? Dawn and Julie. Julie, I'll take you first, and you got to the mute button slightly before I saw it with the land. So Julie, you go, and then Dawn.
I think for me, I think we've all said this across the various presentations made today, is that you don't necessarily have to be a nature-based organisation. Octopus isn't. Our main purpose is to ensure that community centres survive and thrive. There's nothing written into our memorandum and articles of association that we are in that greening or climate space. But we entered into this work through the point of view that, like I said in my presentation, food brings people together, and so does gardening, and so does the green space in where, you know, where people live. So our entry into this work, you know, some 14 years ago, was actually around community cohesion. And that's where we started. So in the answer to the question, I would say, well, are you looking for green organisations, or are you just looking for organisations that you can like engage to help through a process? But we certainly started from the point of view, one, this is work that supports community cohesion around, you know, bringing together diverse groups within a community. And as Rosie said at the beginning of our presentation, we're very much fueled by research that we can get our hands on. And when we saw that report about children and young people growing up in an environment where they actually did not engage with nature at all, that sparks something that you've got to do something for society. So I think I would say to the question is, are you looking at the right organisations, and not necessarily the ones that are kind of on the green side or the gardening side?
Aye, thanks very much, Julie. That's a really important point. And actually, Charlie, really interesting to hear you talk about your park as an organisation, which might be about parks, but actually the things that are core to your mission is not about the nature side of it. It's about those other aspects. So I think that's really, you know, that's telling a story there as well. Dawn, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I think what I'm saying is really building on how Julie just really summarised that. I was going to say that it doesn't just have to be your parks team that works in this space, you know, your health team, your housing team. So think widely about who is working in the area and what it is they're doing and how they can help across the local authority. I was also going to say that, you know, if you have the resources, go to where people are. Don't expect people to come to the parks. You know, that if they're not going to the parks now, they're not going to go to them because you want to do something in them. You know, you need to go where people are. So, you know, go to faith centres, go to community centres, go into schools, wherever it is that your community is, go there first and be prepared to listen first rather than explaining what it is you want to do. Go with an active listening sort of mindset. Thanks, Rory.
Yeah, big +1 to that. Rosie, I saw your hand go up and then go down. Please speak.
I mean, just to really echo that, going to where people are, knock on doors, go and knock on doors in the area and chat to people. And as I think has been said across a lot of what we've said, it takes time, and it does take time, and knocking on doors is not a particularly efficient activity, but it's really, really important. And that's where you can engage people who don't come to parks, but then also maybe don't access any of those spaces that Dawn just mentioned.
Yep, 100%. Charlie, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think it's all been said.
Bang on. The only other thing I would add is actually, to what extent does something have to be top down? And I know this is difficult for local authorities, right? I know certain things are viewed as this is how we do it. And, you know, I've engaged with my own local authority around various issues where a consultation is run in a particular way, and it is a consultation. Here is the proposal. What are your views? Sometimes you get a free text box. Sometimes you get a list of options to represent your feelings. That's really not co-design. And if we want to change the conversation around this, it needs to be a more co-design process. So what opportunity is there to trial something, to innovate, and to, you know, to put it up the chain in the local authority and say, right, with this particular park or this particular space, can it not be top down? Can we actually open this out to participation? And I understand the fear around that, right? That you will get the people that write you letters about dog turds or whatever else being the ones who show up to shout at you. But actually, if you, depending how you do that, if it's done in a different place, that's been mentioned, the discussion there, and also if you involve people in what the question is, I think that's a step that often gets missed. So even we come in at the point of thinking this is the question that we need to ask, to start at the point before, which is how do we get the right questions? And we have to understand people's priorities in order to do that. So it's winding the clock all the way back to that actual point of the things that people care about. And how do you make them intersect with the questions around parks? Now, it's not asking you to be an expert in all those areas. And a local authority, you've got the benefit, of course, of having many people who understand health and those other things. It's an opportunity to bring them in, of course, and have that conversation. But how can you talk to people if they're saying that there's an issue around it being, food security or a food desert where they are, or if there's an issue around access and fear of accessing spaces or whatever it might be, thinking about how that intersects with green spaces and how you can think about those issues and frame the questions in the right way and go to the right place, such as that you'll get the people in the room that you want to talk to and hear from. And the beauty of co-design, I think, is that you end up with a whole bunch of volunteers who want to go and implement stuff. So it really fuels that. You might end up with a community organisation off the back of it because you have created the space for people to meet like-minded folk who they had no idea cared about this stuff. Dawn, I saw your hand pop up there. Was it your hand, Dawn, that went up? No.
No, it's me, Rory.
Julie, sorry.
Rory, that was a great segue because I just thought that was what we've learned through Nature Neighbourhoods is that if you give residents voice and you put in the infrastructure to enable that voice to be heard, an organisation might materialise like what we've seen in Manchester. So I think if an organisation doesn't exist, I always see that there's solutions to every problem. And if the organisation doesn't exist, then enable the community to create it.
Brilliant, Julia. And for those that don't know, and you can go watch the presentation that was given in the other set, the Nature Neighbourhoods session that's part of this series, an organisation called Easy Come, Easy Grow emerged in Manchester as part of our project. We're supporting an organisation called So the City, who work across Manchester, and a group of residents constituted themselves in the process of the project, which we thought that might be lovely if it happens at the end of the project, but it happened halfway through. So just amazing to see, and really, people leaning into their agency and taking on responsibility and a desire to do something about their local green space. I'm going to move on to this question here because perhaps it's related, and I've heard evidence mentioned. Julie, you mentioned it in the context of reading various reports and thinking about what the impact of nature disconnection was. So the question is, with regards to funding to support these projects, what was the main rationale, or was it a combination of different ones, which both charities used as hard evidence to make your case? So Julie, I think we've heard a bit about that inspiration, for your work in Islington. Charlie, is there any thoughts from your side about that sort of evidence base and how you brought that to bear?
Yeah, sure. So we're lucky in Bristol that the council runs a quality of life survey, which gives us a lot of really great data in terms of how people experience their local areas. And there are actually lots of questions in there specifically about parks and park use. So that gives us a wonderful source of data to be able to demonstrate which communities, what areas park use is lowest, and then how that directly correlates to health outcomes. So we definitely use that. It's a big part of why we do our social inclusion research, so that we can show that we've invested in deeply understanding the challenges that certain communities are facing, and that the solutions have literally been co-developed, given to us to share to kind of shape those funding applications. And we also do quite a lot of kind of general surveys, outreach, trying to understand community feedback. And our Wild and Well approach, that community development network approach, gives us that direct link into organisations, whether it's the community anchor organisation, minority-led groups, to properly understand the issues that local people are facing, and why what we're proposing should be the right solution for it. So it's a real blend, I suppose, of big data, local community insights, and kind of co-developed solutions and responses from specific groups.
Thanks, Charlie. Dawn, I can see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. I was just going to add to what Julie and Charlie mentioned, just with some sort of national data sets, which if I can multitask, I will try and put in the chat. If not, we can share later. But just that it might be helpful to use the Natural England's green infrastructure mapping data. There you can overlay access to quality green space or lack of access to quality green space against population density and against the government's indices of multiple deprivation. That's obviously larger data sets, but it might help to start to understand your neighbourhoods in a slightly, through a different lens. There's also Natural England's People and Nature Survey data, which again, are big data sets, big national data sets, but again, it might help to give you sort of national data that you can drill into to help support your case, local communities when in conversation with local authority partnerships, and local authorities, obviously, when in communication with, your partners to help you start to understand some of that, some of that data that is out there. Thanks, Rory.
Thanks, John. Julie or Rosie, is there anything else you'd like to chip into that?
I mean, sorry, quickly. I was just going to say that, I mean, in terms of rationale for like nature projects, I think what's so great about them is that they do so many things. I mean, Julie mentioned community cohesion, Charlie's mentioned health. We talked about food and access to food in our presentation. There's the education side of it. So there's so much that can be done kind of within the green and nature area that's very easy to argue for having so many different benefits for communities and residents.
And all I was going to say, Rory and Charlie and Rosie have said it before, but we can't do enough to reiterate the importance of actually using that data, but then speaking with residents, because first and foremost, a lot of the time we are facilitating work and development in an area where people live. We always have to remind ourselves that whatever we do, whether it's on an estate or in a park, is that this is where people live, and what they feel is important is really important, actually. So the data is one thing, but then you have to take it down to a local level by speaking with residents.
Such an important point, Julie, and actually somebody's asked a question along those lines in the chat, which is, does the use of data support or hinder the process of listening and understanding the priorities of residents? And I think you've spoken to the balance there, actually, between those two things. I think, I come from an ecology background, and there is quite an obsession with the scientific method and the definition of what truth is, right? That's fine, you can do that, and you can figure out the best practice from a biodiversity perspective way of turning a park into a beautiful haven for butterflies, squirrels, birds, whatever you fancy. But of course, that will not hold if everyone around it hates that or their experience of that is, this is not a priority. Can you help address some of my priorities? So I think it is about balancing those two things. There's no harm in presenting people with the information. And I think especially in a co-design process, I think it's really critical to bring that information to bear, because people don't want to just stare at a blank page. They do like stimulation. They do like hearing from people who know things. It's that point that Julie made about the professionals being on tap to provide that info, not on top. We will do to you. You should have a park in this way because it's best for biodiversity. So it's, from my perspective, it's really about, yes, having that data as a means of facilitating a conversation that is more meaningful and grounded in something real, which then you can take to the next level. I think Julie's described that much more eloquently than me a moment ago. Is there anything else anyone would like to add to that particular point around data? I think it's an interesting one. No, Julie, you nailed it before we'd even asked the question. So I'm going to move on to a couple of questions about money here. So one is about maintenance budget for housing land. So a question for Octopus in particular, do you get budget diverted to you when you take that on or when residents take it on?
That's a really easy question. No.
So
but Rosie did come and say to me, interesting, let's explore. So
well, and I would say as well, this is a live discussion with another organisation that's working in nature neighbourhoods, Grant and Community Gardeners. Edinburgh City Council have got a big citywide contract with a provider who manages all the green spaces. And they're often consulting with a local community growing organisation about what the local residents want and getting a sense of what people are doing. And there's a real opportunity there. They want to manage the green space in their area and to get a bit of that budget. And you can bet for sure that a community organisation will be delivering that on a much more cost-effective way than a multinational or a big organisation, in a more community-focused way. So yes, there is something about de-risking, and Julie talked a bit about that, that risk approach and calculated risks being made. But there's big opportunities out there to do some of this work, which require a bit of admin at the outset and a bit of figuring out and a bit of that risk calculation. But the potential benefits are really massive if we can lean into a sort of confident and assured community organisation. But whoever asked that, thanks, and you've given Julie and Rosie a bit of food for thought. There's folk here from Islington Borough Council will be going, and there's a question here again about money, and this is for you, I think, Charlie. Given council spending and service constraints, is there not room for more parish/ward-based community-led service provision and management using social enterprise as well as volunteers and service providers? So in a similar ballpark, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were part of Future Parks as well in the last round, and one of the things that we tested through that was putting out parks in essentially a prospectus to see who wanted to get more involved in kind of the maintenance, management, enterprising element of those green spaces. And we were kind of expecting there to be quite a few organisations who would come forward and say, actually, we want to do the maintenance management and a way of making money and bringing communities together. And it didn't come forward in the way that we thought it would locally. So it's an interesting one. I think maintenance and management, it would be wonderful to have that, because you would see so much more community involvement in spaces. But actually, for us locally, we don't see a huge amount of appetite to do the nuts and bolts of maintaining spaces, because it's a huge responsibility. But that's not to say it doesn't work in other areas, and it's not to say that it's not a model that should be explored. It's just not something, and the parks in trust, putting parks into trust comes up as an annual conversation locally as well, but without a significant amount of investment and budget to go in to be able to kind of create profit to manage those spaces. And obviously what Julie does is a great example of where it does work. But yeah, for us locally, it's not something we've seen a real drive for or appetite for locally. People kind of want the spaces to stay with the council at the moment.
Yes, thanks, Charlie. I mean, good. Let's have the real talk about it. I think so much of this is about individual places and where the capacity is at and what opportunities there are. Sometimes it's down to that seed of an individual or a handful of individuals who picked up something and run with it in a particular place. And I think there are things you can do, and we've spoke about them earlier, in terms of creating the opportunity to do that through co-design, through involving people, through getting them involved and engaged in the process. So I'm conscious of time. I'm getting these little warnings through from the production team, so I need to pay attention to them. And we've got a minute left, so I'm going to hand over in a moment to Matilda just to wrap up. I'm going to point out a data set and a process that my colleague David has mentioned in the chat there, the Urban Forest Accelerator. It's going to be published next week, so look out for that in terms of data and engaging people. Matilda, over to you for the wrap-up. Thanks so much to the panel. Thanks to all of you for joining as well. Brilliant talks and really engaging.
Thank you so much, Rory. And just to add to that very quickly, we are hosting the final webinar in this series on Monday, and it's led by David and the team behind Urban Forest Accelerator. So join us then to hear a little bit more about that work, I'm sure. So thank you so much, Rory, Dawn, Rosie, Julie and Charlie. That was a really fascinating Q&A. It's great to see so much interest in the work you're doing, and it's clearly a testament to how valuable it is. So everyone, if you have any other questions, please get in contact with us directly via our website or by emailing us. We've got a mailing list open, and it's the best way to stay up to date with the programme, so you can sign up to that as well. So bang on time, we've come to the end of the webinar. So all that's left is for me to thank you all for joining. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to connecting with you through the Nature Towns and Cities programme in the future. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.